What's up guys, welcome to Wasted Space, and after a long weekend checking it out, it is time to talk a bit about No Man's Sky. And I'm going to approach this one from the angle of talking a bit about what No Man's Sky is and what No Man's Sky isn't, because the hype built up around this game was so enormous that it could never live up to it, and a lot of weird and wonderful claims were made. I'm not going to go into any discussion about what the devs said and what they did and any of that, because it is a minefield, honestly. And hopefully, by talking a bit about what the game is and isn't, I can also kind of give you guys a bit of a review and my impressions of what I think of the game so far. So let's get started. Really, no. But did we really expect anything else? The game is very arcadey, especially the space combat and the way you can fly. And then there are a few things that really jump out and show you that this is not a simulator in the slightest. My best example is you cannot get too close to the ground on planets. You can't do those ground-hugging flight runs. It simply won't let you. Same way, you can't land manually. You just hit E and it takes you down to the ground and you jump out your cockpit. And it'll only do it in certain places. Now this sounds really negative, and to some extent I would have liked to have seen more options and more ways in which the space combat would feel a bit less like a space arcade game. I think the best example I can give is the combat system is very like Freelancer, so it's just holding the mouse on the target pretty much. Lots of spinning around, but you don't actually have that much control. However, I think from a gameplay perspective this hasn't hurt things. It's often overlooked the effect of over-complicating mechanics on a game. And I hate to use Elite Dangerous as an example here, but I do feel like that's one of the games where they went so far with the space simulator side of things that it can actually be kind of frustrating and tiresome to play at times. In No Man's Sky, everything feels pretty easy. Everything's quite easy to do, and it lets you focus a bit more on what I think the game was more about. Which leads me very nicely onto... And this, kind of as you'd expect, is where the game shines. Now it's definitely not perfect, but what they have managed to mostly avoid is a trap that a lot of procedurally generated games fall into, where everything just lacks any sort of personality, any sort of life to it, because everything's just been assembled by this algorithm that actually doesn't have any awareness of what it all looks like and how it all feels when it's been put together. Now I actually believe they made a really clever decision with this game, which is to have a lot of procedural elements, but then to have almost a director over the top of it. There are some sort of rules, there's something defining things a bit better than just a pure random algorithm would. Which is actually quite a brave decision to make, given the game was being quite obviously advertised as how procedural everything was. It does still have this controlled element to it. You can kind of tell, especially when you're dealing with some of the other races, for example, which I think is probably one of the best parts of the game. It's where the procedural engine seems to really shine. It also gives you this impression that it can't be purely procedural. It's almost too good to be purely procedural. But because of that, what you get at the end of it is a game that does legitimately live on its exploration. I spent the first 2-3 hours just wowing at everything, which is not something I would normally do. I'm not normally so blown away like that. And this went on much longer than I would have expected to, much longer than most of these procedural games that you come across. There are obviously some areas in which the procedural engine was let to go wild. The animals is the best example, and it's one of the areas in which the engine is the weakest, because while there is a wide variety of creatures out there, do not get me wrong, what you tend to do is spend the first 45 minutes or so laughing at them because they look truly ridiculous, and then occasionally get completely weirded out by some of the more bizarre and terrifyingly ugly things that do appear from time to time that make you think, you know what, maybe an exterminatus on this planet wouldn't be such a bad plan. But this is all starting to sound a bit too negative, because this legitimately is where the game shines. I've spent a bit over 20 hours in the game so far, and a lot of that has just been driven by wanting to see the next thing, wanting to find the next planet, see what's on the surface, explore these caves, and that side of things has all been done really, really well. The actual discovery system itself, the ability to find and name plants and animals and planets and so on, was cool to begin with. I have to admit, I very quickly got to the point where all I was really doing was naming planets and systems and just uploaded the rest of the stuff. It's a nice little addition, I guess, why not have it? But it certainly doesn't have any big impact, and that's not, I don't think, going to be the driving force of why you'd enjoy the game. And speaking of driving force for playing the game, So this is a controversial one. There's a lot of discussion out there, a lot of things have been said, and I don't really want to get into that side of things. I'm not too bothered at this point what's been said and what hasn't. I'm more bothered about what we've actually found and experienced. So neither myself nor any of my friends or the people I've spoken to have experienced anything in a multiplayer element. The discovery system's definitely online. You can see it sometimes in the loading screen. You fly through the galaxy and some of the planets will actually have names, which I assume has come from that system. However, I would say, I don't think it would really work even if it was there. If you look at how the game's set up, there wouldn't really be a purpose for it, and more importantly, the map itself is just not conducive to this sort of thing. The map is very difficult to navigate and it's clearly not designed to allow you to call a place home. This is where I'm going to be and I'm going to travel out from there. It's very difficult to backtrack on yourself. There's no real way of setting like home locations or anything like that. There's just no framework for it in the UI, and as far as I can tell in the gameplay either. What would you do when you meet up? There's no framework for doing anything as a pair of people, and there's no real tasks that would make any sense to do as a framework of people. So this is not a defense, more an argument why I believe, even without knowing for sure at this point that there's no multiplayer, you can be pretty damn certain it's not going to have the multiplayer elements that everybody had in their minds as that big pipe dream. You know, I want to be able to meet up with my friends and explore together. There isn't a system for that, guys. There's no way the game will support it because there's nothing in the UI to enable that sort of gameplay. So given we're on the topic of potentially disappointing things, now I felt I had to kind of include this one because everyone does know it's been ported from PS4 to PC. So it's worth touching on, but also there was a lot of hate on release night, mostly down to little bits and bobs that weren't ported quite as well as they could be. So just as an example, and this is a silly little thing, but a lot of them are silly little things that kind of come together to say, while it might not be a horrid console port, there's definitely some bits in there that should have stayed on the console and not come over. So as an example, you can't click on stuff in this game, you have to hold the mouse button down. Sorry, the button down. No, the mouse button, it is a mouse, isn't it? Yeah. You have to hold the mouse button down. That's how you interact with things. That wheel at the top, that doesn't do anything. There are even some controls that are only available on the controller, like free looking around. I can't find a way of doing that via the keyboard and mouse. I can only do it by plugging my controller in. However, those are relatively minor. They're little things that you do get over. I would argue that maybe there's a bit of elements with both the UI and sort of some of the game mechanics like the landing and the flying I mentioned earlier that are probably console orientated as well. But for the most part, the option screen is actually quite pleasant to see. There's a lot of PC options in there, a lot of things that often get left out of console ports when they move over to PC. And more importantly, as far as the game looks and runs, once they sorted out those release night issues, it's been really quite pleasant, and I do like how it appears. It almost looks slightly hand-drawn, which is kind of impressive given it's all 3D rendered, and a lot of it procedurally as well. I've also got to say, it is very easy to play. Even on the PC, the mouse and keyboard controls are pretty spot on, no issues there, and I do legitimately feel a bit sorry for the console guys on their controllers trying to shoot the little drones, because those things are kind of hard to hit, especially if you've only got a thumbstick, and that side of things is really fun. I've actually quite enjoyed the combat, albeit quite simplistic. It's kind of fun, it works. Especially, jetpack, big gun, grenade launcher on it. That's amusing. So now finally, which of course is a pretty big question, and I find almost an ironic one because very often the games with the procedural elements are the games that lack the reason to come back, that lack the reason to make you keep playing them. And there is definitely going to be a bit of that with No Man's Sky. Once you've seen these various combinations of weird animals, once you've been to the various different coloured planets and so on, you've started seeing most of the combinations, you start recognising the building blocks rather than how they've all been assembled. At that point, things are gonna start looking samey. The creatures in particular. You start to recognise the torso shape, and then you're like, oh, it's that torso but with that head and that. And you kind of start to see how it's been put together. And that obviously starts to mean that you get a bit more bored, everything's a bit less exciting. And then of course the gameplay is repetitive. You are doing the same actions over and over again. Albeit within a bit of a framework. There is, for example, some sort of semi-story arcs in it. I don't want to talk very much about that, but there does seem to be essentially 3 different ways in which you can play the game. One of them involves following the atlas, which you get offered right at the start. Don't miss that, by the way, it's by the ship and it's not as obvious as you would expect. The next is of course trying to get to the centre of the universe, which was kind of touted as one of the big goals. And then finally you can just go and explore, make your own path around the place. But in the end, all of these things kind of result in the same gameplay. You're going and exploring planets, you're finding the resources you need to make what you want, be it ship upgrades, tool upgrades, or just the things that enable you to jump a tool, recharging your warp drive. But the fact that alongside this exploration focus, you've also got kind of a character progression, where you're upgrading your exosuit or your multi-tool or your ship, has helped drive me forward with it. It meant that I'm still not bored. 20 plus hours in, I have not got to the centre, I have not followed the storyline through yet, but I'm still feeling a bit of a call to want to go back and play, try and improve my ship, try and find a new cool looking ship. Although it is a bit weird how some of the procedural elements have interacted with this sort of progression side of things, on the basis that it's pretty common for you to go and upgrade a starship to one that's smaller, for example, because everything's randomly generated. The cargo size is nothing to do with what they look like. Same with the guns, and the guns have got a certain Borderlands vibe to them, not surprisingly, and the same thing kinda happened there. You could have a massive cool looking weapon that actually turned out to be rubbish, and the tiny little pea shooter was the really good one. So it's interesting to see how the two things kind of interact. I do think it's taken a tiny bit away from the progression, because you no longer have that, when you upgrade you get something cool and shiny, that new ship that you've been lusting after, look it's that one. But it's absolute heaven for those guys that like to be completionists, that like to go out and see all the different things, understand all the different variants, visit all the places. For you guys, where exploration can drive the gameplay without need for the progression, then there is no end of content here. I've also got to throw in a caveat that one thing we do know for sure, ironically it's that old saying, is that we don't know everything. There are some elements of the game that are still essentially locked. People haven't worked out how to get into them. Kind of Easter egg style, and while I said I wasn't going to mention what the devs have said, there has been a little bit of teasing to do with the idea that there are multiplayer elements there, but they're a bit Easter egg style, so maybe the two things are together. It's all a bit conjecture, don't take my word for this, whatever you do. But it would be, I would say, pretty damn clever if they've been being coy this whole time about whether there's multiplayer or not in there, because actually the multiplayer, or some multiplayer elements at least, some functionality, gets unlocked by someone solving whatever this damn puzzle is. I'm not going to talk too much about what the puzzle is, because obviously there's some spoilers there, there's some bits that maybe you guys want to find out for yourself. But it's certainly an interesting angle, and it means that this story is not complete yet. There's a few bits left before we can close the book on how did No Man's Sky do. So I've tried to give kind of a rundown on what No Man's Sky is and isn't, with a little bit of my thoughts on why they made those decisions and whether or not they were the right ones. Hopefully this has also had the effect of giving you guys an idea of the game, decide whether or not you want to buy it. I personally have enjoyed it, I will continue to enjoy it. Whether I could say it's worth the money because it is an expensive title, I don't know yet, but I would certainly point out that because so much of this is single player focused, because that multiplayer thing is very much on the sideline, which I don't think has harmed the game necessarily, this does not have to be one that you play right now. It's a single player title that you can enjoy when you want. So while there's lots of hype about it, if that price does seem a bit of a barrier, but at the same time you do want to give it a go, don't watch too many videos, just wait until it comes on sale. Then you'll get that first experience yourself, because I tell you, I'm so glad I didn't go and look at any of the spoilers or anything like that, because I had so much more fun with the game at the start than I would have done otherwise, having seen all of those things already. So hope you enjoyed that one, guys. I tried to be as fair as possible. I do enjoy the game, I'm just not sure it's quite what it was hyped up to be. No one's really surprised by that. If you did like it, please hit that like button. Really does help me out, helps get those videos out there, helps more people find the channel. If you didn't like it, you know where that dislike button is. And otherwise, thanks a lot folks, I'll catch you for the next one.